No man could ever love me, Rosalind Fairhaven sobbed, her voice breaking in the cold night air, her hands pressed against her burning face. Behind her, laughter still echoed from the ballroom windows, cruel and bright, cutting through the darkness like broken glass. She had run as far as the garden hedges would allow, past the roses, past the fountain, until her slippers sank into wet grass, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She thought she was alone. She was wrong. That is a foolish thing to say, a low voice said from the shadow of the yew trees. Rosalind froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She spun around, one hand flying to the side of her jaw, to the raised, silvered scar that ran from her ear to her collarbone, the mark that had defined her existence since she was 7 years old, since a fire in her father's stables had taken her mother's life, and left Rosalind branded for the rest of hers. She had thought no one had followed her. She had thought she was safe to fall apart in private. "Who is there?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended, sharp with fear and humiliation both. A tall figure stepped from beneath the trees, and moonlight caught the line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, the slight, deliberate unevenness of his gait as he crossed the lawn toward her. Rosalind knew him at once, though she had never spoken to him before tonight. Everyone in London knew the Duke of Rothmere, even if almost no one had seen him in company for the better part of 2 years. Cassius Vane, a man as famous for his absence from society as other men were famous for their presence in it. "Forgive me," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I did not mean to startle you. I was here before you arrived. I did not wish to announce myself and add to your distress." Rosalind wiped hastily at her cheeks, mortified that a duke, of all people, had witnessed her weeping like a child. "Then you heard what was said to me inside." "I heard enough. And you heard what I said just now, my own foolish words, spoken to no one." "I heard that also." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an expression she could not quite read in the dim light. Not pity, she realized with some surprise. Something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "And I would like to tell you that you are wrong." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "You are very kind to say so, Your Grace, but you need not trouble yourself with empty comfort. I am accustomed to the truth of my situation." "I did not offer comfort. I offered a correction." He took one step closer, and now she could see his face more clearly. A strong face, weathered in a way that suggested years spent somewhere far harsher than a ballroom, with a thin white scar cutting through one dark eyebrow. "Lord Delacroix is a small man who finds cruelty entertaining because he has nothing else to recommend him. His opinion of you says a great deal about his character and nothing at all about your worth." Rosalind's throat tightened. She had endured pitying glances all evening, had endured Delacroix's mocking imitation of her scar in front of a dozen guests, his loud observation that no man of sense would ever offer for a woman marked so plainly by misfortune. She had endured her own aunt's helpless silence, unable to defend her without causing a greater scene. She had not expected, of all people, for the reclusive Duke of Rothmere to step out of the shadows and speak sense to her. "You do not know me," she said quietly. "You cannot know what my worth is or is not." "No," he agreed, "but I know cruelty when I hear it, and I know courage when I see it. And it took considerable courage for you to walk back into that ballroom at all tonight, knowing what waited for you there." She had not walked back in, she had fled, but something in the way he said it, as though he assumed the best of her rather than the worst, made her chest ache in a way she did not have words for. "You are staring at me strangely, Your Grace." "I am wondering," he said slowly, "whether you have ever been asked what you think, rather than told what you are." The question startled her so completely that for a moment she could not answer. No one asked Rosalind Fairhaven what she thought. They looked at her scar, decided what she must feel about it, and proceeded from there. Even her own family, however lovingly, spoke of her prospects in hushed and careful tones, as though her marred face were an illness to be managed rather than a simple fact of her life. "I think," she said finally, testing the words as she spoke them, "that a ballroom full of people who have known me for years took a great deal of pleasure this evening in watching one man make sport of my face. I think that says something rather ugly about the value society places on a woman's appearance over her character. And I think," she added, lifting her chin, surprising herself with her own boldness, "that I am tired of apologizing for existing in a shape that displeases them." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, the ghost of a smile, there and gone. "Now that," he said, "sounds like a woman who does not need my correction after all." A burst of laughter drifted from the ballroom windows again, and Rosalind flinched despite herself. The Duke noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. "You need not go back in there tonight," he said. "There is a side door near the conservatory that leads directly to the carriage drive. I imagine your aunt would understand if you wished to leave early." "How do you know I came with my aunt?" "I make it my business to know a great many things I am not expected to know. It is one of the few advantages of being considered unsociable." There was dry humor in his voice now, and despite everything, despite the ache in her chest and the sting of humiliation still fresh on her skin, Rosalind felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "They call you the recluse of Rothmere," she said before she could stop herself. "I did not expect to find you lurking in gardens rescuing damsels from their own despair." "I was not lurking. I was avoiding the ballroom for reasons entirely my own, and you happened to arrive in the one corner of the garden I had claimed for myself." He paused. "Though I confess I am glad you did." "Why?" He did not answer immediately. He looked away from her, toward the dark line of the hedges, and for a moment, Rosalind thought she saw something pass behind his eyes, a shadow of memory, quickly hidden. "Because it has been a long time since anyone said anything true to me," he said finally. "Most people who speak to me these days want something. My title, my fortune, my name attached to their daughters. It was refreshing to hear a person speak honestly, even in anger, even in pain." Rosalind studied him properly for the first time, not as a distant figure of rumor and speculation, but as a man standing in a garden at night, weary in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "That sounds like a lonely way to live, Your Grace." "It is," he said simply. "I imagine you understand something of loneliness yourself." She did not answer, because the answer was written plainly enough on her face, in the scar he had surely already noticed and chosen, remarkably, not to mention. A cold wind moved through the garden, and Rosalind shivered. The Duke removed his coat without ceremony and held it out to her. She hesitated. "I am not attempting impropriety," he said, with the faintest hint of amusement. "I am attempting to prevent you from catching a chill before your aunt has even noticed you are missing." She took the coat. It was warm from his body, and smelled faintly of cedar and rain. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping it around her shoulders. "You should go back inside before you are missed," he said, though something in his tone suggested he did not particularly want her to go. "I will remain out here a while longer. It would not do for the two of us to be seen returning together. Tongues in that ballroom are sharp enough already tonight." Rosalind nodded, though a strange reluctance held her in place a moment longer. "May I know your name properly, Your Grace? We have not been introduced." "Cassius Vane," he said, with a small, formal bow that seemed almost out of place after the honesty of the last few minutes. "Duke of Rothmere, Rosalind Fairhaven." "I know," he said. "I asked before I approached you. I do not make a habit of addressing strange women in gardens without at least knowing whom I address." Despite herself, Rosalind laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, the first she had managed all evening. "That is oddly reassuring, Your Grace." "I am told I have a talent for oddly reassuring people." He inclined his head toward the house. "Go on, Miss Fairhaven, before the cold does what Lord Delacroix could not." She turned to go, then paused, looking back at him standing alone in the moonlight, this strange, scarred, solitary man who had stepped out of the shadows to tell her she was wrong about herself. "Thank you," she said again, more quietly this time, "for what you said, even if I do not yet believe it." "Belief can be built," he said. "It rarely arrives all at once. Good evening, Miss Fairhaven." She walked back toward the house with his coat still around her shoulders, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with humiliation this time. Behind her, in the shadow of the yew trees, the Duke of Rothmere watched her go and felt, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, the stirring of something he had believed long buried beneath grief and scars of his own. Inside the ballroom, Lord Delacroix was already recounting his cruel jest to a fresh audience, delighted with the attention it had earned him. He did not notice the Duke of Rothmere slip in through the side door some minutes later, nor did he notice the particular way the Duke's gaze moved across the room and settled, briefly, on Rosalind Fairhaven as she rejoined her aunt near the refreshment table, her chin held high despite the whispers that still trailed her like smoke. He had no way of knowing that the woman he had humiliated for sport had just been seen, truly seen, for the first time in years, and that the man who had seen her was not a man inclined to let the matter rest. Mrs. Abernathy, watching her niece return with color restored to her cheeks and an unfamiliar gentleman's coat draped over her shoulders, raised one knowing eyebrow but said nothing. She had learned, in her long years of chaperoning, that some questions were better asked in the privacy of the carriage ride home. "Where have you been, child?" she asked quietly, once they were settled and the carriage had pulled away from the townhouse. And whose coat is this? Rosalind looked down at the fine wool draped around her, still warm, still smelling of cedar and rain. It belongs to the Duke of Rothmere, she said, and could not quite keep the wonder from her voice. He found me in the garden. He said something rather remarkable to me, Aunt. Did he indeed? Mrs. Abernathy's sharp eyes missed nothing. Not the flush in her niece's cheeks, not the softness that had crept into her expression. And what did the famously reclusive Duke of Rothmere have to say to you? He said I was wrong, Rosalind murmured, gazing out the window at the passing lamplight, about no man ever being able to love me. Her aunt was silent for a long moment. Then, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had seen a great many storms brewing before others noticed the clouds, she said, "And do you believe him?" Rosalind did not answer at once. She thought of the shadow beneath the yew trees, of the low, steady voice that had not flinched from her scar or her tears, of the coat still wrapped around her shoulders like an unspoken promise. "I do not know," she said honestly, "but for the first time in a very long while, Aunt, I find that I want to." The carriage rolled on through the dark London streets, carrying Rosalind Fairhaven home with a stranger's coat still around her shoulders, and a stranger's words still echoing in her heart, while behind them, in the ballroom they had left, Lord Delacroix continued his cruel amusement, entirely unaware that he had just made an enemy of the one man in London whose displeasure he could least afford to earn. Neither Rosalind nor the Duke could have known, that night in the garden, how quickly their quiet meeting would become the center of a much larger storm, one involving a scheming society beauty who wanted the Duke's title for herself, a desperate lord who would stop at nothing to secure a fortune through marriage, and a family whose future depended on choices neither Rosalind nor her sister were yet prepared to make. But for now, in the fragile hush after midnight, there was only a scarred young woman walking home in a duke's coat, and a lonely duke standing alone in a garden, both of them quietly certain that something in their lives had just changed forever. 3 days passed before Rosalind saw the Duke again, and in those 3 days she told herself a dozen times that she would not think of him, and thought of him anyway, at breakfast, at needlework, in the quiet hour before sleep when the memory of his voice in the dark garden returned to her unbidden. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not concern themselves with plain, scarred daughters of modest gentry families, however kind their words in a moment of shared solitude, and yet his coat still hung in her wardrobe, carefully brushed and folded, waiting to be returned, and she found herself inventing reasons to delay that return. It was Mrs. Abernathy in the end who forced the matter. "You cannot keep a duke's coat indefinitely, Rosalind," she said over breakfast, buttering her toast with brisk efficiency. "It must be returned, and properly, with a note of thanks. I shall have it sent round to Rothmere House this very morning." "I could deliver it myself," Rosalind said, too quickly, and then flushed at her own eagerness. Her aunt's eyebrow rose. "Could you indeed? And what excuse would a respectable young woman have for calling upon a bachelor duke's residence unaccompanied?" "I did not mean unaccompanied," Rosalind said, recovering herself. "I only meant that a note might seem cold, after his kindness. A note is proper. A visit is presumptuous, whatever kindness prompted it." Mrs. Abernathy softened, seeing her niece's crestfallen expression. "But perhaps, if fortune favors us, we shall encounter his grace in more ordinary circumstances before long. London is not so vast a place as it pretends to be." Fortune, as it happened, required very little persuading. That very afternoon, while Rosalind and her aunt browsed the shelves of a small bookshop on Bond Street, a familiar voice spoke from behind a stack of leather-bound volumes. "Miss Fairhaven, what a pleasant surprise." Rosalind turned, her heart lifting before she had even fully registered the sound of his voice, and found the Duke of Rothmere standing not 3 feet away, a book of poetry in one hand, and an expression of genuine, uncomplicated pleasure on his face that seemed entirely at odds with his reputation for coldness. "Your Grace." She dropped a small curtsy, aware of her aunt's watchful presence beside her. "I did not expect to see you here." "I might say the same. I understand this shop stocks a particularly fine collection of botanical illustrations, and I confess a private fondness for them, though it would ruin my reputation entirely if it became known." A faint smile touched his mouth. "You have found me out, Miss Fairhaven. I am not nearly so forbidding as London believes." "I have your coat," she blurted, and immediately wished she had chosen her words with more care. "That is, I intended to return it. My aunt was to send it round this morning, but perhaps, since we have met by chance, perhaps we might arrange something less formal than a servant's delivery," he finished for her, and there was warmth in his eyes that made her pulse quicken, in a way she did not entirely understand. "Mrs. Abernathy, might I have your permission to call upon your niece properly? I find I would like the opportunity to speak with her again, under circumstances rather less dramatic than our first meeting." Mrs. Abernathy studied him for a long moment, the way a woman studies a horse she is considering purchasing, weighing soundness against price. Whatever she saw satisfied her. "You may call Thursday next, Your Grace. At 4 in the afternoon. I shall be present, of course." "Of course," the Duke agreed, with the faintest hint of amusement, as though he had expected nothing less, and would have thought less of her for offering it. Thursday arrived with an unseasonable brightness, sunlight pouring through the parlor windows as though the day itself had conspired to set the scene. The Duke arrived precisely on time, dressed with quiet elegance, and though Mrs. Abernathy remained present throughout, seated with her needlework in the corner of the room, she proved a remarkably discreet chaperone, absorbed in her stitching while the conversation between her niece and the Duke ranged far beyond the polite nothings that usually filled such visits. "I understand you enjoy reading," the Duke said, settling into the chair across from Rosalind. "The bookshop was not an accident, was it? You had seen me there before." "I confess it was not entirely an accident," Rosalind admitted, coloring slightly. "I had heard from a mutual acquaintance that Your Grace frequented that particular shop on Tuesday afternoons. I did not plan to encounter you, precisely, but I did not object to the possibility." How refreshingly honest. He seemed genuinely delighted by the admission, rather than offended by it. "Most people in my circle prefer their scheming disguised as coincidence. I find I much prefer your version. You make it sound as though I schemed, Your Grace. Did you not?" "Perhaps a little," she conceded, and found herself smiling despite her best efforts at propriety. They spoke for the better part of an hour, of books, of the countryside, of small observations about the absurdities of London society that made them both laugh more than once, much to Mrs. Abernathy's evident surprise. But beneath the easy conversation ran a current of something more serious, and eventually the Duke set down his tea and regarded Rosalind with a gravity that had not been present before. "May I ask you something rather personal, Miss Fairhaven?" "You may ask." "I cannot promise to answer." "Fair enough." He hesitated, as though weighing his words carefully. "I have heard, through channels I will not name, that your family's circumstances are not entirely secure, that there is pressure upon you, or perhaps upon your sister, to marry advantageously and soon." Rosalind's smile faded. She glanced toward her aunt, who had gone very still over her needlework, though her needle had not paused in its rhythm. "Your Grace hears a great deal for a man who rarely leaves his own house. I told you before, I make it my business to know things." His voice softened. "I do not ask to pry, Miss Fairhaven. I ask because I wish to understand your situation, so that I do not act carelessly in it." Rosalind considered lying, considered offering some polite deflection, but something about his directness demanded honesty in return. "My father's investments have not fared well these past years," she said quietly. "Our estate is modest, and my younger sister Charlotte is of an age to marry. There is a gentleman, Lord Delacroix, in fact, the very man who mocked me at the ball, who has shown interest in her. My father is not opposed to the match, given the settlement offered, though I confess I do not trust the man's character, nor do I believe Charlotte is truly fond of him. Delacroix." The Duke's expression darkened, just slightly at the name. "I know something of his character myself. He is not a man I would wish upon anyone I cared for." "You care for my sister's welfare, Your Grace. You have never met her." "I care for yours," he said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice left Rosalind briefly without words. "And a man who would mock a woman's scar for sport in a crowded ballroom is not a man I trust to treat a wife with kindness, whatever fortune he offers her family." Mrs. Abernathy cleared her throat delicately from her corner, a signal that the conversation had ventured into territory requiring careful navigation. The Duke seemed to take the hint, though he did not entirely retreat from the subject. "Forgive me if I have spoken out of turn," he said. "I did not intend to burden you with concerns that are properly your family's own business. I only wished you to know that should circumstances ever require it, you are not without resources beyond your immediate family. That is a generous offer, Your Grace, for a woman you have known scarcely a week. Some acquaintances are measured in weeks. Others are measured in the quality of a single conversation." He rose, understanding perhaps that he had said as much as propriety allowed for one visit. "I have taken enough of your afternoon, Miss Fairhaven, Mrs. Abernathy. I wonder if I might beg the pleasure of your company again soon. There is a small exhibition of landscape paintings opening at the Royal Academy next week that I believe you would find interesting, if your aunt permits it." "I believe that could be arranged," Mrs. Abernathy said, setting down her needlework at last. her expression carefully neutral, though Rosalind did not miss the faint approval in her aunt's eyes. After the Duke had taken his leave, Rosalind stood at the parlor window and watched his carriage draw away down the street, her thoughts a tangle of hope and disbelief she could not quite untangle. It seemed impossible that a man of his rank, his reputation, his evident wealth of choices, should take such careful interest in her, should remember the small details of her situation, should speak of Delacroix with such open distaste, should offer, however obliquely, his protection. "He is not like other men of his rank," her aunt observed quietly, coming to stand beside her at the window. "I have watched a great many suitors call in this house over the years. Rosalind, some sincere, most not. That man looks at you as though you are the most interesting person in any room he enters. That is not a common thing, whatever his title. Do you think he means what he says, Aunt? About Delacroix? About wishing to help?" "I think," Mrs. Abernathy said slowly, "that men who have suffered greatly themselves often recognize suffering in others more clearly than those who have never known hardship. The Duke carries his own scars, Rosalind, even if his are less visible than yours. Perhaps that is why he sees you so clearly, when the rest of society sees only your face." Rosalind thought of the thin white scar through his eyebrow, of the slight unevenness in his gait she had noticed but not yet dared to ask about, of the shadow that had passed behind his eyes when he spoke of loneliness in the garden. She wondered what battles had left their marks upon him, what losses had taught him to recognize pain in a stranger's tears. She did not yet know that within a fortnight, Lord Delacroix would learn of the Duke's growing attentions toward the elder Fairhaven sister, and would begin, quietly and with considerable malice, to plot a way to turn that attention to his own advantage. Nor did she know that a woman named Beatrice Thorncliffe, who had set her own sights on the Duke of Rothmere long before Rosalind Fairhaven had ever crossed his path, was already watching the pair with narrowed eyes and a rapidly forming plan of her own. For now, Rosalind knew only that for the second time in her life, a Duke had looked at her scarred face and seen something worth returning to see again, and that small, fragile certainty was enough to carry her through the long, hopeful week that stretched ahead before she would see him next. The exhibition at the Royal Academy proved to be the first of many such outings, each one arranged with the same careful, deliberate casualness that had marked the Duke's first approach in the bookshop. He was, Rosalind quickly learned, a man who did nothing entirely by accident, however much he preferred the appearance of spontaneity. Within a fortnight, their acquaintance had grown into something that resembled, unmistakably, a courtship, though neither of them spoke the word aloud. They walked together in Hyde Park on mild afternoons, Mrs. Abernathy trailing at a discreet distance, or occasionally a maid when her aunt's duties elsewhere prevented her attendance. They attended a concert of chamber music, where the Duke revealed an unexpected knowledge of composition that surprised Rosalind into asking how a man so famously absent from society had acquired such refined taste. "One does not need to attend balls to appreciate music, Miss Fairhaven," he said, with the dry humor she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him. "I have simply learned to enjoy such things in smaller, quieter company. It is a habit I find I no longer wish to break, now that I have found company worth keeping." The words warmed her more than she cared to admit, and she found herself glancing at him more often than propriety strictly allowed, cataloging small details she had not noticed before. The way he favored his left leg slightly when standing too long, the faint scar visible at his wrist when his sleeve rode up, the careful, deliberate way he positioned himself so that his stronger side faced any room they entered. "You are watching me rather closely," he observed one afternoon, as they walked slowly along a quieter path away from the fashionable promenade, where London's elite paraded themselves for one another's inspection. "Forgive me. I did not mean to stare." "I do not mind your staring, Miss Fairhaven. I find I mind it considerably less than the stares of most others." He paused beside a bench overlooking a small pond, and after a moment's hesitation, gestured for her to sit. "You have noticed my leg, I think, and other things besides." "I have," she admitted, "though I did not wish to pry, given how carefully you have avoided prying into matters I have not offered to discuss myself. I would rather you asked than wondered in silence." He sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the still water of the pond rather than on her face, and Rosalind understood instinctively that this was easier for him without the weight of direct eye contact. "I served for some years in the war against Napoleon, Miss Fairhaven. I was not always a duke, content to hide within the walls of Rothmere House. I commanded a company of men, and I lost a great many of them in ways I still see when I close my eyes at night." "I am sorry," she said quietly, resisting the urge to reach for his hand, uncertain whether such a gesture would comfort or intrude. At the Battle of Salamanca, a cannon shot struck close enough to take my leg nearly from beneath me and shatter the bones in my hand beyond what the surgeons believed could be mended. I was fortunate to keep the leg at all, though I have walked with this unevenness ever since, and my hand has never fully regained its strength. He turned his palm upward, and she saw for the first time the mottled scarring across his fingers, the slight rigidity in how they curled. When I returned to England, I inherited my brother's title within the same year, as he had died of a fever while I still lay recovering abroad. I came home to a dukedom I had never wanted, a body that no longer obeyed me as it once had, and a wife who took one look at what the war had made of me and decided she preferred the company of a healthier man. Rosalind's breath caught. You were married. Briefly, unhappily, in the end, though I will not speak ill of the dead. She died 2 years past, of a fever not unlike the one that took my brother, before we ever managed to reconcile what remained of our marriage. I do not tell you this for sympathy, Miss Fairhaven. I tell you because you deserve to know the truth of the man courting you, rather than the polished rumor London prefers to whisper about the recluse of Rothmere. Is that why you withdrew from society? Because of your wife and your injuries? Both, in their way. I found I had little patience left for a world that valued a man's appearance and easy charm over the substance beneath it. My wife was not a cruel woman, Miss Fairhaven, but she married a golden young officer and found herself instead with a scarred, limping duke, and she could never quite forgive me for the disappointment, however unfair that judgment was. He finally looked at her then, and something raw and honest passed between them in that look. I understood, that night in the garden when you wept over your scar, exactly what it means to be measured and found wanting for a mark you did not choose and cannot change. That is why I spoke to you as I did. Not out of pity, but out of recognition. Rosalind reached for his scarred hand then, unable to hold herself back any longer, and felt him go very still beneath her touch, as though uncertain how to receive a gesture he had perhaps not been offered in a very long time. Then we are neither of us as unlovable as the world would have us believe, she said softly. No, he agreed, his voice rough with something that might have been relief. I do not believe we are. They sat in comfortable silence for a long while after that, watching the ducks glide across the pond, and when at last they rose to continue their walk, something unspoken had settled firmly between them, a foundation laid on honesty rather than performance. But not everyone in London watched this growing attachment with pleasure. Beatrice Thorncliffe, the acknowledged beauty of the season, and a woman who had spent the better part of 2 years quietly cultivating an eventual match with the Duke of Rothmere, had noticed his sudden and uncharacteristic sociability with considerable alarm. She had attended the same exhibition at the Royal Academy, had watched from across the gallery as the Duke leaned close to say something that made Rosalind Fairhaven laugh, had felt something cold and furious settle in her chest at the sight. It is absurd, she said to her closest confidant, Miss Harriet Price, as they took tea the following afternoon, in Beatrice's fashionably appointed drawing room. The Duke of Rothmere, courting the scarred Fairhaven girl, of all creatures. He has ignored every eligible woman in London for 2 years, myself included, and now he squires about a woman whose own family can barely afford her season, simply because she wept prettily in his garden. Perhaps he finds her interesting, Harriet offered, somewhat timidly, for she had never quite shared her friend's enthusiasm for the ruthless pursuit of advantageous marriage. Interesting is not the same as suitable. Beatrice set down her teacup with a sharp click against its saucer. A duke requires a duchess who can grace a room, who can host with elegance, who will not send half his guests into fits of pity or discomfort at first glance. I have spent 2 seasons positioning myself precisely to be that woman, and I do not intend to lose the position to a girl whose greatest accomplishment is surviving a stable fire. What do you intend to do? Beatrice's eyes narrowed with calculation. I intend to remind the Duke, gently and repeatedly, of exactly what sort of duchess Miss Fairhaven would make. I imagine the Ton would find it rather easy to believe that his sudden interest in her is nothing more than pity dressed up as affection. Men of his sort, proud, wounded, private, do not care to be thought pitiable themselves, nor do they care for their motives to be publicly questioned. If I can plant sufficient doubt in Miss Fairhaven's mind about the Duke's true feelings, she may withdraw from the courtship entirely, sparing us all the tedious spectacle of watching it continue. It was, in its way, a cunning plan, built on the particular cruelty of striking at the exact insecurity Rosalind had carried since childhood, the fear that any kindness shown to her was merely pity in a more flattering disguise. Beatrice began her campaign carefully, dropping remarks at select gatherings, expressing loud sympathy for poor Miss Fairhaven, so fortunate to have caught a duke's charitable attention. Careful always to frame her words as concern rather than malice, so that anyone repeating them could not easily be accused of cruelty. The rumors traveled, as rumors in London always did, with remarkable speed and considerable embellishment. By the end of the following week, Rosalind's own aunt had heard whispers of it from a fellow chaperone at a card party, and though Mrs. Abernathy dismissed the gossip as the transparent jealousy it clearly was, she could not entirely shield her niece from hearing similar whispers herself, delivered with false sympathy by acquaintances who claimed only to have Rosalind's best interests at heart. Meanwhile, Lord Delacroix had troubles of his own brewing. His pursuit of Charlotte Fairhaven had grown more insistent as his own debts mounted, and he had begun to notice, with mounting irritation, that Rosalind's newfound favor with the Duke of Rothmere had made the Fairhaven family considerably less desperate for his own offer than they had been mere weeks earlier. Charlotte herself, emboldened by her sister's example, had begun to express, quietly but firmly, her own reluctance toward the match, a development that infuriated Delacroix beyond reason. "Your sister has made you bold," he said to Charlotte one afternoon, cornering her briefly in the garden of a mutual acquaintance's home, his voice pleasant but his eyes hard. "I wonder if she has considered how quickly that boldness might cost your family everything, should her duke prove less devoted than she imagines." "I do not know what you mean, my lord," Charlotte said, though a chill had settled over her at his tone. "I mean only that fortunes are fragile things, Miss Fairhaven, and reputations more fragile still. Your sister would do well to remember that a duke's favor, once lost, is very rarely regained, and a scarred spinster with no dowry to speak of has very few prospects left, should this particular one disappoint her." He offered a thin smile and a bow before departing, leaving Charlotte shaken and uncertain whether to relay the exchange to her sister at all. She told Rosalind that evening regardless, unable to carry the weight of the threat alone, and Rosalind listened with a growing sense of unease that settled deep in her stomach. Between Beatrice Thorncliffe's poisonous rumors and Delacroix's veiled threats, it seemed that the fragile happiness she had found in the Duke's company was already under quiet siege from two directions at once, and she had not yet decided how best to defend it, or whether it could survive the assault at all. That night, unable to sleep, Rosalind sat by her window and thought of the Duke's scarred hand beneath her own, of his voice speaking honestly of loss and disappointment in a way no one had ever spoken to her before. She wanted, desperately, to believe that what had grown between them was real and lasting, immune to the small cruelties of jealous rivals and desperate men. But doubt, once planted, has a way of taking root even in the most fertile soil of hope, and Rosalind found herself wondering, for the first time since that night in the garden, whether she was foolish to trust a happiness that seemed, in the cold light of a sleepless night, almost too fortunate to be entirely true. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a liveried footman on horseback, sealed with the Rothmere crest in dark blue wax. Mrs. Abernathy broke the seal with careful fingers and read the contents twice, before passing it to Rosalind, with an expression that mixed astonishment and something like triumph. "The Duke has invited us to Rothmere," she said, "the estate, not the townhouse, a fortnight's visit, ostensibly to view the grounds before autumn sets in, though I suspect His Grace has rather more particular intentions than landscape appreciation." Rosalind read the elegant script herself, her pulse quickening at the formality of it, at the significance she understood such an invitation carried. A gentleman did not invite a young woman and her family to his country estate for a fortnight's stay, unless his intentions had grown considerably more serious than a few walks in Hyde Park suggested. Her father, upon hearing the news, expressed cautious pleasure, tempered by his own private awareness of the family's financial difficulties and what such a connection might mean for their future security, though he was careful never to voice such calculations aloud in his daughter's presence. Rothmere itself proved even grander than Rosalind had imagined, a sprawling estate of golden stone set among rolling hills, its gardens meticulously kept despite its master's reputation for solitude, its halls lined with portraits of vain ancestors stretching back generations. The Duke greeted the Fairhaven family personally upon their arrival, his manner warm in a way that seemed to surprise his own household staff, several of whom exchanged quiet, curious glances at the sight of their master smiling so readily. "Welcome to Rothmere," he said, offering his good hand to help Rosalind down from the carriage. "I confess I have looked forward to this visit rather more than is perhaps dignified for a man of my age and rank." "You are not so very old, Your Grace," Rosalind said, smiling despite the fatigue of travel. "Old enough to know better than to hope so openly for anything," he replied, "and yet here I am, hoping regardless." The days that followed settled into an easy, pleasant rhythm. Mornings were spent walking the extensive gardens, where the Duke showed genuine and surprising knowledge of the roses his late mother had once cultivated, tending them himself in the years since her passing, rather than leaving the task entirely to gardeners. Afternoons brought quiet conversation in the library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with books that made Rosalind's eyes widen with undisguised delight upon first entering it. "You may borrow anything you wish," the Duke told her, watching her trail her fingers reverently along the spines of volumes she recognized, and others she had only heard described. "I confess this room has been my truest companion these past 2 years. I am glad to finally share it with someone who might appreciate it as I do." It was during one such afternoon in the library, with rain falling softly against the tall windows and a fire crackling in the hearth, that Rosalind finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind since their conversation by the pond in Hyde Park. "You mentioned your wife once, Your Grace, but only briefly. I do not wish to pry into grief that is not mine to know, but I confess I have wondered about her." The Duke set down the book he had been idly turning through, and was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Her name was Miranda. We married when I was still young and whole and considerably more foolish than I am now. Before the war took what it took from me, she was beautiful and charming, and I believed myself fortunate beyond measure to have secured her hand." He turned the ring he still wore, out of habit rather than sentiment, on his uninjured hand. "When I returned from Spain, broken in the ways I have already described to you, she tried, for a time, to be the wife she had promised to be, but I watched something die in her eyes every time she looked at my hand, my leg, the man I had become instead of the man she married. In the end, we lived largely separate lives, in separate houses even, until her death 2 years ago spared us both the indignity of pretending otherwise any longer." "That sounds very lonely for both of you." It was. He met her eyes then, steady and unflinching. "I tell you this, Rosalind, because I do not wish you to imagine yourself entering into something with a man who does not understand the weight of what he offers. I know what it is to be loved conditionally, to have that love withdrawn the moment circumstance made it inconvenient. I would never ask that of you, nor would I ever offer you anything less than the whole of what I have left to give." It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and Rosalind felt the intimacy of it settle warmly beneath her ribs. "You have already given me more honesty than I have received from anyone else in my life, Your Grace. I do not think you capable of the conditional love you describe. I hope you are right." He reached for her hand, his scarred fingers closing gently around hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together in the firelit quiet, the rain drumming softly against the windows outside. It was into this fragile, growing intimacy that the first poisoned whisper arrived, carried not by Beatrice Thorncliffe herself, who remained in London plotting her next move, but by a letter she had arranged to have delivered to a mutual acquaintance currently visiting a neighboring estate, knowing full well that country gossip traveled nearly as fast as its London counterpart. The letter suggested in careful, deniable language that the Duke's attentions toward Miss Fairhaven stemmed entirely from guilt and pity rather than genuine affection, that he had confided to a close friend his belief that the poor creature deserves some measure of kindness before she resigns herself entirely to spinsterhood, and that his eventual intention was merely to see her comfortably settled rather than to marry her himself. The rumor reached Rosalind through Charlotte, who had heard it from a maid who had heard it from a groom in the neighboring household, the source thoroughly obscured by the time it reached Rosalind's ears, but the poison no less potent for its circuitous journey. Charlotte relayed it hesitantly one evening as the sisters prepared for bed, clearly reluctant to cause her sister pain but equally reluctant to let Rosalind remain ignorant of talk that might affect her happiness. "I am certain it is nothing but jealous invention," Charlotte said quickly, watching her sister's face pale. "You have seen how he looks at you, Rosalind. No man performs such tenderness merely from pity." But the words had already found their mark, sinking into the old, familiar wound Rosalind had carried since childhood, the deep and persistent fear that any affection shown to her scarred face must be, at its root, a performance of charity rather than genuine desire. She thought of the Duke's careful attentiveness, his gentle correction of Delacroix's cruelty in the garden that first night, and wondered, with a sick twist of doubt, whether kindness and pity might sometimes wear identical faces, indistinguishable to a heart too eager to believe in its own good fortune. She said nothing to the Duke the following day, though he noticed at once that something had shifted in her manner, a new hesitance in her smile, a reluctance to meet his eyes for more than a moment at a time. "You seem troubled, Rosalind," he said, as they walked together through the rose garden in the cool morning air. "Have I done something to distress you?" "No," she said, too quickly, and then, unable to maintain the pretense under his steady, concerned gaze, relented. "I have heard something, Your Grace. Gossip, I am certain, nothing more. But it has unsettled me regardless. Tell me." She hesitated, ashamed of the doubt, even as she felt compelled to voice it. "I have heard it said that your attentions toward me stem from pity rather than genuine regard. That you have spoken of wishing to see me comfortably settled before I resign myself to spinsterhood, as though I were a charitable project rather than a woman you might actually wish to marry." The Duke's expression darkened, not with the guilt of a man caught in a lie, but with the particular fury of a man wrongly accused. "I have said no such thing, to anyone, at any time. Whoever has spread this falsehood has done so with deliberate malice, Rosalind, and I would very much like to know their name. I do not know its source. It reached me second-hand, perhaps third-hand." "Then let me speak plainly, so that no rumor, however cleverly disguised, can ever again plant such doubt in your heart." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his despite the stiffness of his injured fingers. "I do not court you from pity, Rosalind Fairhaven. I court you because you are the first person in years who has spoken to me as a man rather than a title, because your honesty humbles me, because your laughter has become the thing I most look forward to in any given day, and because when I imagine the remainder of my life, I find I cannot imagine it without you in it. If that is pity, then I do not understand the word at all." Relief flooded through her, warm and overwhelming, though a small, wary part of her mind noted how easily doubt had taken root despite everything he had already shown her, and wondered whether such vulnerability to poisoned words might prove a weakness someone could exploit again, and more successfully, in the future. She did not yet know how soon that fear would be tested, nor how much more dangerous the next attack would prove to be, orchestrated not from a distance through careless gossip, but delivered directly and with far greater malice by a man who had already shown himself willing to threaten an entire family's future for his own advantage. For now, though, standing in the rose garden with the Duke's scarred hands wrapped around her own, and his declaration still ringing in her ears, Rosalind allowed herself, cautiously, to believe. The letter arrived at the Fairhaven townhouse 3 days after the family's return from Rothmere, delivered not by a footman but slipped beneath the front door under cover of darkness, addressed to Rosalind's father in a hand he did not immediately recognize. He read it alone in his study, and when he emerged, his face had gone the color of old ash. "What is it, Papa?" Rosalind asked, alarmed by his expression. "Lord Delacroix," he said heavily, sinking into a chair as though his legs could no longer properly support him. "He claims to possess evidence of impropriety involving your sister, evidence he threatens to make public unless Charlotte agrees to marry him within the fortnight, and unless you, Rosalind, withdraw entirely from your association with the Duke of Rothmere." The room seemed to tilt beneath Rosalind's feet. "What evidence? Charlotte has done nothing improper. I would stake my life upon it." "He does not specify. He speaks only of a compromising letter, supposedly written in Charlotte's hand to a young officer she knew briefly 2 summers past, before you ever met the Duke. He claims the letter's contents, if made public, would ruin her reputation beyond any hope of respectable marriage, and would damage this family's standing so severely that even your own prospects with his grace would not survive the scandal." Charlotte, summoned to the study and told of the threat, went pale but firm. "I wrote no such letter, Papa. I corresponded with Lieutenant Ashworth briefly, as many young women correspond with family friends, but nothing in those letters could be called improper. He must have forged something, or twisted an innocent exchange into something it was never intended to be. Whether forged or twisted, the damage of its publication would be the same," their father said grimly. "You know how quickly London seizes upon such scandal, true or false. Once the accusation is made publicly, the truth of the matter becomes almost irrelevant. Your reputation, and by extension this family's standing, would be destroyed regardless of the letter's actual contents." Rosalind's mind raced through the implications, each one more devastating than the last. If Delacroix followed through on his threat, Charlotte's prospects would be ruined entirely, and the scandal would inevitably touch Rosalind's own association with the Duke, potentially giving Beatrice Thorncliffe and others of her ilk exactly the ammunition they needed to convince him that the Fairhaven family brought nothing but trouble and disgrace to his ancient name. "I must end things with the Duke," Rosalind said quietly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth even as she spoke them. "If my association with him is part of what Delacroix uses as leverage, then removing that leverage may be the only way to protect Charlotte." "Rosalind, no," Charlotte protested immediately. "I will not have you sacrifice your own happiness for my sake. We will find another way." "What other way is there, Charlotte? I cannot risk your entire future, your entire reputation, for the sake of my own hopes with a man I have known scarcely 2 months, however dear those hopes have become to me." Rosalind's voice shook, but her resolve, once formed, proved difficult to shake. "I will write to the Duke tonight and explain that circumstances require me to withdraw from our courtship. I will not tell him why. It is better, I think, if he believes I have simply changed my mind, rather than drawing him into a scandal that is not his to bear." Her father and sister argued against this course through the remainder of the evening, but Rosalind, once she had settled upon a plan, proved as immovable as her scarred and resolute suitor had ever been. She retired to her room and composed a letter to the Duke, brief and deliberately cold, informing him that she had reconsidered the wisdom of their continued association and wished him well in finding a more suitable match. She sealed it with trembling hands and gave it to a servant to deliver before dawn, before she could lose her nerve and unravel the entire careful deception. The Duke received the letter at breakfast and read it twice before setting it down with an expression his valet had never before seen upon his master's face. Not merely disappointment, but a kind of controlled, dangerous fury that suggested something beneath the letter's cold words did not ring entirely true. "Something is wrong," he said aloud, to no one in particular, and within the hour he had called for his horse and ridden directly to the Fairhaven townhouse, arriving unannounced and demanding, with uncharacteristic force, to speak with Rosalind immediately. Mrs. Abernathy, caught between propriety and her own private suspicion that something beyond a simple change of heart lay behind her niece's sudden withdrawal, allowed the Duke into the parlor and sent for Rosalind, who arrived pale and visibly distressed, confirming his suspicions before she had even spoken a word. "Tell me the truth," he said, without preamble, once the parlor door had closed behind them, Mrs. Abernathy remaining discreetly but watchfully in the corner. "Your letter this morning did not sound like the woman I have come to know these past weeks. Something has happened. I would rather know the truth, however painful, than accept a coward's excuse dressed up as a change of heart." Rosalind's composure, carefully maintained through a sleepless night, finally cracked. "It is not my heart that has changed, Your Grace. It is my sister's future that is at stake, and I will not see it destroyed for the sake of my own happiness." Haltingly, and then with growing urgency, she told him everything: Delacroix's threat, the alleged compromising letter, the demand that Charlotte marry him, and that Rosalind withdraw entirely from the Duke's company, lest the scandal touch his name as well as their own. The Duke listened in silence, his jaw tightening progressively as the account unfolded, until by the end his expression had settled into something cold and formidable that Rosalind had never before seen upon his features. "You believed," he said slowly, once she had finished, "that ending our courtship would protect your sister, and that I would simply accept your cold letter and walk away, leaving you to face this threat entirely alone? I believed it was the only way to keep the scandal from touching you and your name, Your Grace. You have already suffered enough from a wife who abandoned you when circumstance grew difficult. I would not have you suffer further association with a family under threat of public disgrace. Rosalind." He crossed the room and took her hands, his grip firm despite the stiffness of his injured fingers. "Do you truly believe I am the sort of man who flees at the first sign of difficulty? I fought at Salamanca while cannon fire tore men apart around me. I have buried a brother, a wife, and more soldiers under my command than I care to count. I did not survive all of that merely to abandon the one woman who has made me want to survive at all, the moment her family faces a scoundrel's threat. But your reputation? My reputation has already survived 2 years of London calling me the recluse of Rothmere. It will survive standing beside the woman I intend to marry while we expose a lying, scheming lord for exactly the coward he is." His voice hardened. "Delacroix has made a critical error, Miss Fairhaven. He has threatened a family I now consider very much my own concern, and he has done so believing that no one would call his bluff. I intend to call it, thoroughly and publicly, and I would be very much obliged if you would trust me enough to let me do so." Rosalind stared up at him, hope and fear warring visibly across her features. "What do you intend to do?" "First, I intend to discover the truth of this so-called compromising letter. I have connections that Delacroix does not know I possess, including a former officer of my acquaintance who served alongside Lieutenant Ashworth and who may be able to shed light on whether any such correspondence ever existed, or whether it has been fabricated entirely from whole cloth." His expression turned grim with purpose. "Second, I intend to make it exceedingly clear to Lord Delacroix, in terms he cannot mistake, that threatening the Fairhaven family means threatening a family under the protection of the Duke of Rothmere, and that I am not a man he wishes to make an enemy of. And if the letter proves genuine, however innocently intended, then we shall address that truth honestly, rather than allowing a blackmailer to dictate the terms of how that truth is revealed. But I do not believe, from everything you have told me of your sister's character, that we shall find anything more scandalous than a young woman's harmless correspondence with a family friend, twisted by a desperate man into something it was never meant to be. Rosalind felt something loosen in her chest, some tightly wound fear beginning, cautiously, to release its grip. You would do all this for my family? I would do considerably more than this, for the family I intend to make my own. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips gently against her scarred knuckles, a gesture of such tender formality that Rosalind felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. Withdraw your letter, Rosalind. Trust me to handle Delacroix as he deserves, and promise me that the next time trouble finds this family, you will come to me directly, rather than attempting to protect me by pushing me away. I promise, she whispered, and meant it entirely. Colonel Hawthorne, the Duke's old war companion and closest confidant, arrived at Rothmere House within 2 days of being summoned, and proved instrumental in unraveling Delacroix's scheme with remarkable speed. Through his own military connections, he confirmed within a week that Lieutenant Ashworth had indeed corresponded briefly with Charlotte Fairhaven 2 summers past, but that the correspondence, examined and shared willingly by the lieutenant himself once the matter was explained to him, contained nothing beyond the innocent pleasantries of old family friends, no impropriety whatsoever, and certainly nothing resembling the scandalous content Delacroix had described in his threatening letter. More damning still, Colonel Hawthorne's inquiries revealed that Delacroix's own finances had grown considerably more desperate than London society realized, with gambling debts mounting to a sum that threatened his family's ancestral home, a fact he had concealed carefully behind a facade of continued prosperity. His pursuit of Charlotte, and his subsequent blackmail attempt when that pursuit met resistance, had been born not of genuine affection but of pure, desperate financial necessity. Armed with this knowledge, the Duke requested a private meeting with Lord Delacroix, one that would prove, within days, to change the fortunes of everyone involved in ways none of them had fully anticipated. Lord Delacroix arrived at Rothmere House expecting a private, discreet conversation, the sort of quiet negotiation between gentlemen that could be conducted with plausible deniability and no witnesses to complicate matters afterward. He was shown instead into a drawing room already occupied by the Duke of Rothmere, Colonel Hawthorne, and, to his visible alarm, a solicitor holding a thin folder of documents. Your Grace, Delacroix said, recovering his composure with practiced ease, I confess I expected a more private audience for a matter of such delicate family concern. There is nothing delicate about blackmail, Lord Delacroix, the Duke replied, his voice deceptively calm, and I find I have little patience remaining for private discretion, given the nature of what you have attempted against a family I hold in the highest regard. Delacroix's smile faltered, just slightly. I do not know what you mean, Your Grace. I have merely sought to protect Miss Charlotte Fairhaven's reputation, given certain unfortunate correspondence that has come to my attention. You mean the letter you claim exists between Miss Fairhaven and Lieutenant Ashworth, the solicitor said, opening his folder. A letter we have now examined in full, at the lieutenant's own willing disclosure, and which contains nothing beyond the ordinary pleasantries exchanged between family friends. There is no impropriety within it whatsoever, my lord, a fact you are surely aware of, given that no such scandalous correspondence appears to exist at all beyond your own claims. The color drained slowly from Delacroix's face as the solicitor continued, methodically and without mercy, laying out the full extent of what Colonel Hawthorne's inquiries had uncovered: the mounting gambling debts, the desperate need for Charlotte's dowry to save his family's estate from ruin, the fabricated threat designed to force a marriage that had nothing whatsoever to do with genuine affection and everything to do with financial desperation. You have precisely 2 choices before you, Lord Delacroix, the Duke said, once the solicitor had finished. You may withdraw your suit for Miss Fairhaven's hand entirely, cease all contact with the Fairhaven family, and depart London for a period of your own choosing, until the matter is thoroughly forgotten. Or I may make the full extent of your fabricated blackmail attempt, along with the precise state of your finances, known to every drawing room and gentlemen's club in London, at which point I imagine your creditors will show considerably less patience than they have shown thus far. You would ruin me over a misunderstanding, Delacroix said, though the fight had visibly gone out of his voice. I would ruin you over a deliberate, calculated attempt to destroy an innocent young woman's reputation and coerce a family into a marriage none of them wanted, purely to serve your own desperate finances. Call it whatever softer name comforts you, my lord, but do not mistake my patience for uncertainty regarding the truth of what you have done. Delacroix left Rothmere House considerably paler than he had arrived, and within a fortnight, Word spread through London that he had quietly departed for an extended stay on the continent. His creditors left grumbling, but his public reputation, for now, spared the full weight of exposure the Duke had threatened. It was, Rosalind reflected upon hearing the news, a more merciful outcome than the man perhaps deserved, though she understood the Duke's restraint had been calculated as much for Charlotte's sake, sparing her any lingering association with scandal, as for any generosity toward Delacroix himself. But if Delacroix's threat had been neutralized, Beatrice Thorncliffe's campaign of quiet poison had not yet run its course, and upon learning of the Duke's decisive public defense of the Fairhaven family, she recognized with growing desperation that her window for separating the couple was rapidly closing. She resolved upon one final, more direct attempt, arriving uninvited at a garden party where she knew both Rosalind and the Duke would be present, determined to force a confrontation that would settle the matter once and for all, one way or another. She found her opportunity when the Duke was briefly called away to speak with his host, leaving Rosalind momentarily alone near the refreshment table. Beatrice approached with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing harmless while delivering considerable harm. "Miss Fairhaven," she said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "how fortunate to find you unaccompanied for a moment. I wonder if I might offer some friendly counsel, woman to woman." "I am not certain we are well enough acquainted for counsel, Miss Thorncliffe, but you may say what you wish. I only observe that the Duke of Rothmere is a man of considerable pride, however gentle his public manner toward you may appear. Men of his sort do not easily forgive being made objects of pity by their own choices, and I wonder whether you have considered how it must appear to London, a duke of his standing courting a woman whose family so recently required rescue from scandal and debt. Some might call it charity dressed up as courtship. I wonder if the Duke himself has begun to tire of playing the rescuing hero, now that the drama has largely concluded." The words struck precisely where Beatrice intended them to strike, and for a moment, old doubt flickered dangerously across Rosalind's expression. But she had grown, these past weeks, in ways Beatrice had not accounted for, strengthened by the Duke's unwavering honesty and by her own hard-won understanding of exactly what genuine affection looked like, as distinct from the pale imitation of pity. "I think, Miss Thorncliffe," Rosalind said with a calm that surprised even herself, "that you mistake your own ambitions for insight into the Duke's character. He has told me himself, in terms I have no reason to doubt, precisely why he cares for me, and none of those reasons resembled pity in the slightest. I wonder, rather, whether it is your own disappointment speaking, now that 2 years of careful positioning have failed to secure the match you clearly hoped for." Beatrice's composure cracked, just briefly, before she recovered it. "You are rather bold, for a woman whose entire prospects rest upon one man's fickle affection." "Perhaps, but I would rather be bold and honest than spend 2 years positioning myself for a man's attention, only to watch it settle elsewhere despite my every calculated effort." Rosalind held Beatrice's gaze steadily. "I believe, Miss Thorncliffe, that this conversation has run its course." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and lingering nerves, unaware that the Duke had returned in time to hear the final exchange of their conversation. His expression, as he watched Rosalind depart Beatrice's company with her chin held high, one of unmistakable pride. That evening, as the garden party wound toward its close and the sky deepened toward twilight, the Duke found Rosalind near the same fountain where their courtship had first taken root, and something in his expression told her that the moment she had both hoped for and feared had finally arrived. "I heard your conversation with Miss Thorncliffe," he said, without preamble, "or the end of it at least. I confess I have rarely felt prouder of anyone in my life. She meant to wound me, Your Grace, and very nearly succeeded, if I am honest. But I found I no longer wished to let her poison decide what I believed about your feelings toward me." "Good." He took her hands, his expression suddenly grave with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I find I can no longer bear the uncertainty of courtship, Rosalind, nor the risk that some future scheme, from Beatrice Thorncliffe or anyone else, might succeed where this one failed in convincing you to doubt what I feel. I love you. Not out of pity, not out of loneliness, though I confess both played some part in bringing us together. I love you because you have shown me, again and again, a courage and honesty I had begun to believe no longer existed in the world I inhabit. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" Rosalind's answer came not in careful, measured words, but in the immediate, overwhelming rush of joy that flooded through her, tears springing unbidden to her eyes as she nodded, unable for a moment to trust her own voice. "Yes," she finally managed, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Cassius, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, gently, beneath the deepening twilight sky, And Rosalind Fairhaven, who had once sobbed in a darkened garden that no man could ever love her, found herself held in the arms of a duke who had proven, beyond any lingering doubt, exactly how wrong those words had been. But their happiness, however hard-won, would face one final and far more public test before the wedding bells could ring. For Beatrice Thorncliffe, humiliated and increasingly desperate, had one last card yet to play, and she intended to play it in the most public setting London society could offer, where an entire ballroom would bear witness to whatever outcome followed. News of the Duke of Rothmere's engagement to Rosalind Fairhaven spread through London within days, carried on a wave of astonishment that touched nearly every drawing room in the city. Most of society received the news with genuine warmth, curious to see the reclusive Duke finally settling into happiness after years of isolation, though a persistent undercurrent of gossip continued to question whether a woman of Rosalind's modest fortune and visible scarring truly belonged among the ranks of England's great houses. The Duke, characteristically, addressed this undercurrent in the most direct manner available to him. He announced a grand ball at Rothmere House to formally celebrate the engagement, inviting the full breadth of London society, including, deliberately and pointedly, both Lord Delacroix's remaining associates and Beatrice Thorncliffe herself, a decision that surprised Colonel Hawthorne considerably when the Duke explained his reasoning. "You mean to invite the very people who tried to destroy this match?" the Colonel asked, incredulous. "I mean to demonstrate, publicly and unmistakably, that their efforts failed entirely," the Duke replied. "There is no better answer to poisoned whispers than open, confident happiness displayed before the very people who spread them. Rosalind deserves to walk into that ballroom with her head held high, watched by everyone who ever doubted her worth, and to leave it having proven them all decisively wrong." Rosalind, when informed of the guest list, felt a flutter of nervous apprehension, but found, upon reflection, that she welcomed the challenge rather than feared it. She had spent too many years shrinking from rooms full of judgment. She would not shrink from this one, not on the night she stood beside the man who loved her, in the home that would soon be hers. The night of the ball arrived clear and cold, stars bright above Rothmere's illuminated windows, carriages lining the drive in numbers that suggested nearly all of fashionable London had accepted the invitation, whether from genuine goodwill or simple curiosity to witness the spectacle firsthand. Rosalind dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a gown of deep sapphire silk that Mrs. Abernathy had helped select specifically to complement rather than conceal her scar, a deliberate choice that felt, to Rosalind, like a small declaration of war against every whispered judgment she had endured over the years. "You look magnificent," her aunt said, adjusting a final pin in her niece's hair with visible emotion. "I only wish your mother had lived to see this night." "I think she would be proud," Rosalind said softly, thinking of the woman she had lost so young, whose death had left her marked in a way society had never let her forget. "I think she would tell me exactly what the Duke told me that first night in the garden, that I was never as unlovable as the world tried to convince me I was." The ballroom, when Rosalind entered on the Duke's arm, fell into the particular hush that greets any entrance of significance, hundreds of eyes turning to take in the sight of the reclusive Duke of Rothmere, transformed and evidently joyful, standing beside the woman who had accomplished what 2 years of London's finest had failed to achieve. The Duke, sensing the weight of every gaze upon them, leaned close to murmur in Rosalind's ear, "You need not prove anything to anyone tonight, Rosalind, but if you wish to enjoy watching a few particular people squirm, I would not think less of you for it." Rosalind laughed, genuine and unguarded, and felt the last of her nervousness dissolve into something closer to confidence. "I believe I might enjoy that rather more than I should admit, Your Grace." They moved through the early part of the evening with an ease that seemed to disarm even the most skeptical observers, the Duke attentive and openly affectionate in a manner entirely at odds with his reputation for coldness, Rosalind gracious and quick-witted in conversation, winning over guest after guest who had arrived prepared to judge, and left instead genuinely charmed. Charlotte, radiant with relief at her family's changed fortunes, danced happily nearby, occasionally catching her sister's eye with a delighted smile that spoke volumes about how far they had traveled together since that terrible night at the ball where this entire story had begun. It was well past midnight, during a brief lull in the dancing, that Beatrice Thorncliffe finally made her move, approaching the small gathered circle around the Duke and his betrothed with a bright, brittle smile that immediately put several onlookers on alert. "Your Grace, Miss Fairhaven," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the surrounding guests. "What a lovely celebration, though I confess I am curious, given the rather sudden nature of your engagement, whether the timing owes anything to certain family difficulties Miss Fairhaven's household recently faced. I understand there was some unpleasantness involving Lord Delacroix and an alleged scandal touching Miss Charlotte's reputation. One does wonder whether His Grace's proposal came from love, or from a gallant desire to rescue a family from ruin before the true nature of that scandal became more widely known. A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the nearby guests, several turning with open curiosity to see how the couple would respond to such a pointed public challenge. It was precisely the confrontation Beatrice had been engineering for weeks, a final, desperate attempt to plant enough doubt in the assembled company's minds to tarnish the engagement beyond easy repair. The Duke's expression, however, did not so much as flicker with alarm. Instead, something that might almost have been amusement passed across his features, and he addressed the gathered crowd with the calm, commanding authority of a man entirely unafraid of scrutiny. "Since Miss Thorncliffe has raised the matter so publicly," he said, his voice carrying easily across the now attentive circle of guests, "allow me to settle it just as publicly, so that no further whisper need trouble anyone's curiosity. Lord Delacroix did indeed attempt to blackmail the Fairhaven family, threatening to circulate a fabricated scandal about Miss Charlotte, unless she agreed to marry him, and unless Miss Rosalind withdrew from my company. I investigated the matter personally, discovered the alleged scandal to be entirely fictitious, invented by a man drowning in gambling debts and desperate for Miss Charlotte's dowry to save himself from ruin. Lord Delacroix has since departed London, having chosen exile over exposure of his own considerable dishonesty." Gasps rippled through the surrounding guests, and Beatrice's confident smile began, visibly, to falter. "As for my proposal," the Duke continued, turning to look directly at Rosalind with an expression of such open tenderness that several onlookers audibly softened at the sight, "I asked Miss Fairhaven to marry me, not out of rescue or pity, but because she is the single most honest, courageous, and remarkable woman I have had the privilege to know in my 32 years upon this earth. I met her first on a night when a cruel man mocked her before an entire ballroom, and she wept in a darkened garden believing herself unlovable because of a scar she never chose to bear. I told her then that she was wrong, and I have spent every day since proving that truth to her, and I intend to spend the rest of my life continuing to do so." He turned back to face the crowd, and now his gaze settled, deliberately and without apology, on Beatrice Thorncliffe herself. "I understand that not everyone in this room wished to see this match succeed, for reasons of their own ambition or disappointment. I bear no particular ill will toward such feelings, misguided as they may be. But I will not tolerate further attempts to wound my betrothed with insinuation and gossip, however cleverly disguised as polite curiosity. Miss Fairhaven's worth has never rested upon her fortune, her connections, or the smoothness of her skin, and any person in this room who cannot recognize the value of her character deserves rather more pity than she ever has." The silence that followed was absolute, broken finally by a smattering of applause from several guests moved by the Duke's evident sincerity, applause that grew steadily as it spread through the room, until even those who had arrived skeptical found themselves swept into open approval of the couple standing before them. Beatrice Thorncliffe, thoroughly and publicly outmaneuvered, offered a stiff, hollow congratulation before retreating from the circle entirely, her ambitions toward the Duke of Rothmere finally and unmistakably extinguished, her reputation among London's gossips considerably diminished by an evening that had revealed her machinations for exactly what they were. Rosalind, standing beside the Duke as the applause continued to swell around them, felt something powerful and unfamiliar settle into place within her chest, a sense of belonging she had not believed herself capable of feeling in a room full of London's elite. She thought of every whispered cruelty she had endured over the years, every pitying glance, every careful assumption that her scarred face disqualified her from happiness, love, or respect, and she thought of the man beside her, who had looked at that same scar and seen instead a woman worth loving without condition or reservation. "Thank you," she murmured to him quietly, as the crowd's attention finally began to disperse toward the resuming music. "For all of it. For that night in the garden. For standing against Delacroix. For what you just said before this entire room. You have nothing to thank me for," he said, drawing her hand to his lips. "I have merely told the truth, as I have tried to do with you from the very beginning. The rest, Rosalind, was entirely your own doing. You are the one who found the courage to walk back into rooms full of judgment and prove them wrong, again and again. I have only had the good fortune to watch you do it." The orchestra began a new waltz, and the Duke drew Rosalind onto the floor, the two of them turning gracefully beneath the bright chandeliers while the assembled guests watched with open admiration, The earlier tension of Beatrice's challenge entirely dissolved into the simple, undeniable warmth of two people, evidently and thoroughly in love. Charlotte watched from the edge of the floor with tears of happiness in her eyes. Mrs. Abernathy dabbed discreetly at her own eyes with a lace handkerchief, and even Colonel Hawthorne, not a man given easily to sentiment, found himself smiling as he watched his old friend finally claim the happiness that years of war and loss had once seemed to have stolen from him entirely. 3 months later, in the small stone chapel on the Rothmere estate, Rosalind Fairhaven became Rosalind Vane, Duchess of Rothmere, in a ceremony attended by family and true friends, rather than the sprawling spectacle London society might have expected, a choice both bride and groom had made deliberately, wishing their wedding day to belong to genuine affection rather than public performance. As the Duke lifted her veil and looked upon her face, scar and all, with an expression of undisguised joy, Rosalind thought back one final time to that night in the darkened garden, to the desperate, hopeless words she had sobbed into the cold air, and marveled at how completely, how thoroughly, they had been proven wrong. No man could ever love her, she had believed, but a Duke had stepped from the shadows to prove otherwise, and he had never once wavered since. Winter came early to Rothmere that first year of their marriage, dusting the rose garden in frost and turning the long gallery windows silver with morning ice. And it was in that quiet, snowbound season that Rosalind discovered marriage to a duke bore little resemblance to the glittering fantasy London gossips liked to imagine. There were estate ledgers to review together at the long desk in the library, tenant families to visit in the village below the hill, and long evenings spent simply reading side by side before the fire, Cassius's scarred hand resting easily over hers as though it had always belonged there. She found she loved this quieter version of their life together even more than the courtship that had preceded it, for it was in these small, unremarkable hours that she understood most clearly how completely he had meant every word he had spoken to her. Charlotte's own happiness arrived the following spring, when a modest, steady gentleman named Edward Barrington, a friend of Colonel Hawthorne's introduced at Rothmere during the previous autumn's house party, began a quiet and considerate courtship entirely unlike the desperate ambition Lord Delacroix had once shown. Edward possessed neither great fortune nor grand title, but he possessed a genuine fondness for Charlotte's quick laughter, and an evident respect for her opinions that Charlotte, having watched her sister's own courtship unfold with such honesty, had come to recognize as considerably more valuable than any dowry-driven proposal. Rosalind watched her younger sister accept his hand with the same fierce joy she had felt accepting Cassius's own, and understood that the courage she had found that terrible night in the garden had rippled outward to touch her sister's fortunes as well. News occasionally reached them of Lord Delacroix, diminished and increasingly desperate on the continent, his creditors having finally caught up with him despite his flight from London, though neither Rosalind nor the Duke wasted much thought on a man who had chosen cruelty and desperation over honesty, and had reaped precisely the consequences such choices tend to sow. Beatrice Thorncliffe, for her part, married within the year, not the Duke she had once schemed to claim, but a wealthy baron considerably older than herself, and society whispered, not unkindly, that she seemed to have finally learned the value of contentment over ambition, though Rosalind could not help but hope, whenever the woman's name arose, that some measure of genuine happiness had found her, despite the harm she had once attempted. It was nearly 2 years into their marriage, on an ordinary evening much like countless others they had shared, that Rosalind found herself once again standing beneath the same yew trees where their story had first begun, drawn there by some sentimental impulse she could not fully explain, wrapped in her husband's coat against the evening chill, just as she had been wrapped in it that very first night. Cassius found her there, as he so often seemed to find her, and came to stand beside her without a word, simply watching the same moonlit garden that had once witnessed her deepest despair transform, slowly and completely, into her deepest joy. "Do you remember what you said to me here?" he asked softly, "on the night we met?" "I remember every word," Rosalind said, leaning into his shoulder. "I said no man could ever love me, and I told you that you were wrong." He turned to face her fully, his hand coming to rest gently against the scar along her jaw, a touch he had given her 1,000 times since, always with the same reverent tenderness. "I have spent 2 years trying to prove that correction true, Rosalind, and I find I am nowhere near finished proving it. I do not believe I ever will be." She smiled up at him, this scarred, honest, steadfast man who had stepped out of shadow and darkness to change the entire course of her life, and felt, as she always did in his presence now, the last faint echo of that old, desperate fear, finally and completely silenced. "Then I suppose we shall simply have to spend the rest of our lives finding out," she said, "how thoroughly wrong I was, He laughed, warm and unguarded, the sound of a man who had once believed himself beyond happiness, and had found it anyway, in a garden, on an ordinary night, in the honest words of a weeping stranger who had turned out, against every expectation either of them once carried, to be exactly the person he had been waiting for, all along. And as the stars deepened overhead, and the cold winter air settled softly around them, the Duke of Rothmere drew his Duchess close, and kissed her beneath the same yew trees where he had once spoken from the shadows, no longer a lonely, scarred recluse and a grieving, doubtful young woman, but simply two people who had found, against every cruel expectation the world had once pressed upon them both, a love that neither scar nor scandal nor scheming rival had ever managed to diminish. In the years that followed, Rothmere's halls filled gradually with the sound of children's laughter, and the estate that had once stood silent and shuddered against the world became known instead for its warmth, its open doors, and the Duke and Duchess who welcomed guests of every station with the same genuine kindness that had first drawn them together. Rosalind never did fully forget the cruelty of that first ballroom, nor the desperate words she had once sobbed into the darkness, but she carried the memory now not as a wound, but as the beginning of the truest story of her life, one she would tell her own daughters someday, so that they too might understand that no scar, however deep, could ever truly determine the shape or worth of the love a person deserved to find.